How far would you go to taste revenge? The protagonist of tonight's disturbing little tale takes the concept to a whole new level. Let me know in the comments if you think he went too far, or not far enough. I am Dr. Gallow, and this is called Double Down. The girl didn't say anything for most of the drive home. She just sat in the back seat looking out of the window at the trees, occasionally breathing steam onto the glass before drawing little pictures on it with a slender finger. He couldn't quite see what those pictures were, but he fancied he saw a love heart. The wipers squeaked away the drizzle on the windscreen and the tyres hissed across the wet surface of the road, and those were the only other sounds, save for the occasional pinging rhythm that went with the indicator when the car turned. As he looked at her in the mirror, he was, once again, taken aback by just how much she looked like his mother. The girl was what they called an undercut. After Affinitine had paved the way for legal human cloning, the cloning industry, like every industry, was scrutinized, regulated and taxed to the hilt, as the usual lot made sure they were getting their fat fingers stuck into the pie. Of course, Affinitine's line of clones, neo-doubles as they were called, were top of the line, and as such were very expensive. Affinitine made more than enough profit for the CEO to get filthy rich, and the politicians to take their cuts with fees and permits and licenses. And, as with every industry, alongside the legitimate products came the black market knockoffs to cater for people like him, who couldn't afford a genuine neo-double, and that's when the undercuts were born. There was no legal obligation to care for a knockoff like there was for a neo-double, because knockoffs were illegal in the first place. You were supposed to register a clone in the same way you would a new birth, even though the law didn't recognize clones as humans. They had to be accounted for because, whilst not afforded the rights of humans, they still needed to be accommodated like them, in that they required food, healthcare and lodgings. The more clones in existence, the bigger the impact on the human population. The powers that be had even introduced a new question on the annual census form to declare clones alongside your spouse, your kids, your dog. Following registration, buyers then had to sign a declaration of care that they would do their utmost to ensure it lived a happy life. Buyers were made to promise they were going to keep it fed and warm, to make sure it continued to get some sort of education, and to get it medical attention when required, although the legal definition of when required was unclear, having never been tested in court. In the more liberal media, those outlets which had lobbied for and championed the legal protections for clones in the first place, there had been some stories about neo-doubles dying through neglect or violence, of rape and torture. In the end, nobody had cared enough about them to begin a lawsuit or even a real investigation, but the risk of a hefty fine remained, and that, along with the limited resources he had gained by selling his mother's old house, was another reason he'd chosen to buy a clone with no paper trail. "What's my name?" she asked him. He glanced in the mirror again and saw his mother, a girl, staring back at him. "You don't have one." "Doesn't everybody have a name?" "People have names. You're not a person." Her eyebrows furrowed and she went back to staring out of the window through a clear patch she'd rubbed out of the condensation. He didn't fully understand the cloning process, but he understood that they were all birthed with a common knowledge appropriate to their age. Something in the method allowed them to implant a certain level of education, speech, the ability to read and write if they were old enough to do those things. They had no inherited memories, so they all had to become reacquainted with their families. It had been described to him as being like a form of amnesia. They understood the world, they just had no knowledge of their place in it, as if select chunks of their mind had disappeared. He imagined it was something like dementia. For all other intents and purposes, however, his mother's doppelganger was the same as any other 13-year-old girl. He pulled into the driveway of the new place and turned off the engine, glancing out of the windows to see if any of his neighbours were twitching their curtains to see what he was up to. He didn't notice any movement, so he got out and walked around the car to open the passenger door. She turned her legs sideways and climbed out, standing in the gravel with her brown sandals over her white socks. She wore a simple white linen dress, as was standard. All the girls were sent home with the same uniform. He didn't know why. "Is this our house?" she asked as he led her up to the front door. "It's my house," he said, unlocking it and pushing her inside before slamming it shut again. It was a modest place in comparison to the house he'd inherited, but he didn't need much space, and it was about all he could afford after he'd spent the money on the undercut. There was only one bedroom, and the kitchen and living room were basically the same space, no doors or walls between them. What it did have, and what he'd specifically looked for when browsing properties, was a cellar. He pulled down a cord, and the naked light bulb in the centre of the room clicked into life. The brickwork of the walls were exposed, unpainted. The floor was bare concrete. There was a mattress in the corner without pillows, sheets, or blankets. A wooden chair in the middle of the room under the light bulb. A bucket in another corner. In her naivete, his guest saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Sit down," he told her, and she obeyed, taking her place in the wooden chair. He stood in front of her and looked at her face. Much younger, of course, but the resemblance to his mother was uncanny. He knew well enough how she'd looked at that age. There had been black and white pictures of her as a child in a shoebox, which he'd left in the house with all her other stuff after handing the keys over to the buyer. The only thing of hers he'd taken was her old hairbrush. He'd needed something with her cells on it for them to grow the girl before him. "You're 13, he told her, and she nodded. "I was 13 once, a long time ago. My mother started drinking more when I was 13. He stopped himself from going any further. What was coming didn't need justification, and the thing in the chair didn't need to know. In fact, he supposed, the whole thing would be so much worse for her if there didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. "Close your eyes," he said, and, dutifully, she did. He produced the short metal pole from his inside jacket pocket. It was made of iron, heavy. He took a step back from her to line himself up. His tongue went to the roof of his mouth and dislodged the top row of false teeth that were stuck there, and he poked at the gaps along his gums where the real ones used to be. Then he pushed the dentures back into place with a wet click and held the pole out at arm's length behind him, took a step toward her, and swung it into her top lip. Most of the teeth on the right side of her mouth snapped and splintered with a muffled crunch, while the force of the blow knocked her, and the chair, over. The back of her head hit the concrete, but he estimated only a minor concussion at worst. He wasn't sure if her jawbone was intact. It took her a moment to realize what had happened and for the pain to explode throughout her face. When it did, she began to scream and cough and spit out blood and fragments onto the floor of her new home. He turned and left, locking the cellar door behind him, and put his hand up inside his t-shirt, tracing his fingers around some of the scars on his torso as he ascended the stairs. The old drunk cunt was long gone, but that bleeding little facsimile in the basement was going to help him work through some of his trauma.